All right, buckle up, because today we're diving deep into something really interesting. We've got reports, interviews, a whole stack of case studies, really,
Hmm.
all about regenerative tourism. And it's a concept that goes way beyond, just your typical sustainable travel buzzwords. And we're going to zero in specifically on how Saudi Arabia is putting it into practice, like reshaping their entire tourism industry. I'll be honest, when I first started going through all this, I was a bit surprised. Saudi Arabia, the oil giant, at the forefront of green travel. Not exactly what I pictured.
Yeah, it's kind of a fascinating paradox, isn't it? What really caught my eye is how ambitious their goals are. They're shooting for a 30% net conservation benefit by 2040. That's not just about minimizing harm, they want to actually leave the environment better off than they found it.
That is a bold target, especially when you think about the scale of some of these projects we're talking about. Luxury resorts, entire destinations built from scratch. So
Yeah.
how do they plan on actually pulling this off?
Well, a big part of it is restoring natural ecosystems, like going all in on rewilding. The Red Sea Global Landscape Nursery is a prime example. It's massive, they say, the largest in the Middle East. Their goal is to grow over 30 million plants by 2030 to landscape their resorts and revitalize the whole surrounding environment.
30 million plants. That's mind-boggling. But it also makes you wonder, how do you even start to grow that much in the middle of a desert?
They've had to come up with some pretty creative solutions. The nursery's actually divided into different climate zones. There's even a tropical zone with water lilies and koi fish.
Wow, really?
Yeah, it allows them to cultivate all sorts of species, some not even native to the region, but essential for boosting biodiversity.
So it's not just planting any old tree. It's carefully choosing the right ones to create a thriving ecosystem. Sounds like a very
Yeah.
scientific approach.
Absolutely, and that scientific rigor extends to their construction methods, too. The Shura Links golf course, for instance, designed to blend right into the natural dunes with minimal maintained turf. They're using things like soil sensors to optimize water use and really minimize their environmental impact.
Makes sense, and it ties into something else we read about. Saudi Arabia's push for renewable energy.
That's it.
Seems like they're really committed to powering their tourism infrastructure with clean energy.
Yeah, they've built the world's first solar-powered 5G network in an off-grid desert location, which is pretty remarkable. And it's not just for communication, they're using it to power things like security cameras and environmental sensors.
That's impressive. Solar power, 5G, rewilding the desert. It's almost like they're building a futuristic eco-city right in the middle of nowhere.
There are definitely some parallels there, and this innovation carries over to their underwater projects as well. They're doing some fascinating work with coral reef conservation.
Yeah, I was intrigued by those reports on their coral nurseries. Apparently, they're growing these resilient coral species and then transplanting them back onto the reefs. What makes them resilient exactly?
Well, that's where the science gets really interesting. They're using probiotics, kind of like what you might take for gut health, to strengthen the coral's immune systems,
Hmm.
help them deal with the stresses of climate change, like rising sea temperatures and ocean acidification.
So giving the corals a little extra help to survive, that's amazing. But I also read about them creating artificial reefs. Why is that necessary?
Artificial reefs provide more habitat for marine life, especially where natural reefs have been damaged. They're experimenting with different materials and designs, even using 3D printing to create these intricate structures. It's all about mimicking the complexity of natural reefs.
It sounds like they're pulling out all the stops to protect those ecosystems. And speaking of going above and beyond, we can't forget their focus on accessibility.
Oh, absolutely. Project Aurelia is groundbreaking stuff. They're aiming to create the most accessible tourism destination in the world, way beyond just meeting basic standards.
We saw pictures of adapted guest rooms with roll-in showers, adjustable beds, all sorts of thoughtful features. But it goes way beyond just mobility. They're addressing all sorts of needs.
One detail that stuck with me was the Wama Sailing Club. They have boats specially designed for sailors with various disabilities so they can participate alongside everyone else.
It's so important to ensure everyone can experience these incredible places. But what about the people who already live there? How are they benefiting from all this?
That's a crucial part of regenerative tourism, for sure. Red Sea Global is really focused on creating jobs and opportunities for local communities. They have training programs to prepare people for jobs in the tourism industry, and they prioritize hiring locals and sourcing from local businesses.
So it's not just about fancy resorts. It's about building a sustainable future for the people who call this place home. We often hear concerns about tourism pushing out local communities or eroding cultural traditions.
Right, and it's something Red Sea Global is very aware of. They're working closely with those communities to make sure their cultural heritage is preserved, even incorporating traditional architecture and design elements into the resorts.
Trying to find that balance between attracting tourists and preserving the authenticity of the region. A complex challenge, but it seems like they're making a genuine effort.
And that effort shows in their commitment to working with scientists and researchers. They have whole teams studying everything from marine ecosystems to social impact, using that data to inform their every decision.
Yeah, we read interviews with several of those scientists. They were all clearly very passionate about their work. One of them, Dr. Cecilia Martin, said something that really resonated with me. She said, "So far, tourism has gone in the opposite way. Hence, now tourism cannot but be regenerative, to compensate for past mistakes and allow future generations to enjoy the destination too."
It's a powerful statement that really highlights how urgent this shift towards a more regenerative approach is. We can't just keep taking from the planet without giving something back.
It's realizing that travel has a responsibility to do good, not just be about entertainment or escape.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating to see a country like Saudi Arabia, with its history so tied to oil, taking such a strong stance on sustainability.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, from desert nurseries to coral probiotics to all this cutting-edge technology. What are your initial thoughts? Does any of this change your perception of Saudi Arabia?
It definitely does. It's challenging the stereotypes, showing a side of the country most people wouldn't expect.
I agree. It's making me rethink what's possible with sustainable travel. But I also have to wonder, is all this just clever PR? Or is there real substance behind it?
That's a question we'll dig into further in the next part of our deep dive. We'll take a closer look at the challenges they're facing, the potential impact of all this, and whether this model of regenerative tourism can truly be scaled up to transform the whole industry.
Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll keep unpacking this fascinating topic. Welcome back. We're continuing our deep dive into Saudi Arabia's ambitious push into regenerative tourism. And the more we learn about these projects, the more questions seem to come up. One thing that's been on my mind is the sheer scale of what they're attempting. We were talking about transforming huge areas of desert and coastline. How do you even begin to manage the environmental impact of something that big?
It's a really good question, and it's something that Red Sea Global has considered right from the start. One of their key strategies is what they call sensitive development. Basically, it means only developing a small portion of the total land within their destinations. So the majority of the land is left completely untouched, allowing those natural ecosystems to thrive.
So it's about choosing carefully where they build. That makes sense. But even with a small footprint, there's still going to be challenges, right?
Yeah.
Especially in a fragile environment like the desert.
Absolutely. And one of the biggest challenges is water scarcity. Saudi Arabia has very limited freshwater resources. And, traditional tourism is a huge water drain. Think about all the swimming pools, golf courses, landscaping that usually come with large resorts.
Yeah, it sounds like a recipe for disaster in a region already facing water shortages. So how are they dealing with that?
They're tackling it from multiple angles. First, they're reducing water use wherever possible, designing their resorts with water-efficient fixtures, appliances, and using native plants that don't need much irrigation. Then they're also investing in advanced water treatment tech, so using treated wastewater for irrigation, things like that. And they have desalination plants powered by renewable energy to produce fresh water.
So they're aiming for a closed-loop system, reusing and recycling water as much as they can. That's pretty impressive. But water isn't the only resource they have to manage. What about energy consumption? These mega projects are bound to need a lot of power.
Well, that's where their commitment to renewable energy really comes into play. They've set a target of 100% renewable energy for their whole tourism infrastructure. They're constructing these huge solar farms and even looking into wind power in some areas.
Ambitious for sure, but it also makes good business sense. Relying on fossil fuels would not only be bad for the environment, but it would also leave them vulnerable to unpredictable energy prices down the line.
Exactly, and it fits with Saudi Arabia's overall strategy of diversifying their economy, moving away from that dependence on oil.
Speaking of diversification, let's talk about the economic impact of all this. One of the core principles of regenerative tourism is ensuring that local communities share in the benefits. How is Red Sea Global putting that into practice?
Well, their focus is on creating jobs and opportunities for Saudis, especially those living in the areas where these projects are happening. So they have these vocational training programs to get people ready for jobs in the tourism sector, and they prioritize hiring locals for both construction and operational roles.
So not just creating any jobs, but making sure they benefit the people who need them most. What about supporting local businesses?
That's another big priority for them. They're working with local farmers, fishermen to set up sustainable supply chains for the resorts, making sure that food and other goods are sourced locally as much as possible. They're also supporting local entrepreneurs, small businesses, helping them thrive as part of this new tourism economy.
It sounds like they're trying to create this ripple effect of positive economic impact across the whole region. But I do wonder about the potential impact on local culture and traditions. Is there a risk that this influx of international tourists could lead to those traditions fading away?
It's a valid concern, and Red Sea Global seems to be taking it seriously. They're working closely with local communities to make sure their cultural heritage is both respected and preserved. They're incorporating traditional architecture and design into their resorts, showcasing local arts and crafts, and they're developing cultural experiences, tours, things like that, allowing visitors to learn about and appreciate the history and traditions of the region.
So finding a balance, welcoming the world, while holding on to what makes these destinations unique. It's a tricky thing to get right, but they seem to be committed to trying.
They also seem to be recognizing that regenerative tourism isn't just about the environment and the economy, it's about social impact too. They're striving to create destinations that are inclusive and accessible for everyone, regardless of their abilities.
Right, like Project Aurelia we talked about earlier, aiming to make their destinations the most accessible in the world. It's a hugely ambitious goal, but I think it has the potential to be truly transformative, not just for people with disabilities, but for everyone.
Absolutely. When you design for accessibility, you're essentially designing for everyone. You end up with spaces and experiences that are more user-friendly and enjoyable for people of all ages, abilities, and backgrounds.
It's acknowledging that diversity is a strength and everyone deserves the chance to experience travel.
And it goes beyond just physical accessibility. It's about building a culture of inclusivity where everyone feels welcome and respected.
We've talked about a lot of positive aspects of what Saudi Arabia is doing, but I think we should also address some of the potential challenges and drawbacks. One thing that comes to mind is the reliance on technology. There's a lot of high-tech solutions in play, from AI monitoring coral reefs to these smart irrigation systems. What happens if those systems fail or there are unintended consequences?
That's a really important point. Anytime you depend heavily on technology, there's a risk of things going wrong. Red Sea Global seems to be aware of this, and they're building in backups and redundancy. They're also making sure that local communities have the knowledge and skills to keep those technologies running.
So it's not just about implementing the technology, it's about ensuring it's sustainable and resilient for the long haul. Another concern I have is the potential for greenwashing. Could some of these initiatives be more about good PR than a real commitment to sustainability?
It's a question that often comes up when you see big corporations or governments making these grand claims about sustainability. But in this case with Red Sea Global, I think there's reason to believe their commitment is genuine. They're putting a lot of resources behind it, setting ambitious targets, measuring their impact, and they're publishing detailed sustainability reports.
And they're also open to scrutiny from independent experts, engaging with the international community. That level of transparency and accountability is encouraging.
It's important to be critical, hold them to their word, but it's also important to recognize the progress they're making and to see this as a potential model for how tourism could be done differently.
So thinking about the future, I'm curious to explore the long-term implications of this model. Could regenerative tourism become the norm, not just the exception? What would that mean for the travel industry and for the planet as a whole?
Those are the big questions, aren't they? And we'll dive into those in the final part of our deep dive. We'll look at whether this model can be replicated in other places, the hurdles that need to be overcome, and what it would take for regenerative tourism to truly revolutionize the way we travel.
All right, welcome back to our final segment on regenerative tourism. We've been focusing on Saudi Arabia's ambitious plans, uncovering some pretty incredible innovations and commitments. But now for the big question. Can this model, this approach, actually reshape the whole travel industry?
Yeah, the million-dollar question, right? Can we go beyond just a few isolated examples of good intentions and actually change the system, change how we travel as a whole? I mean, let's face it, the way we've been doing tourism has put a massive strain on the planet and often leaves local communities worse off.
Exactly. And so much of what we've been talking about with Saudi Arabia's approach hinges on thinking long-term, making big investments up front, and really committing to that idea of leaving things better than you found them. A pretty different way of thinking compared to the usual fly in, fly out, leave no trace approach.
It really is, and that's what makes it so interesting, but also so challenging. Scaling this up would require a huge shift in thinking from both the travel industry and from travelers themselves. We'd have to rethink everything, how destinations are developed, even how we measure success.
We've touched on some of the hurdles already, the financial investment, the risk of greenwashing, the reliance on technology that might not be accessible everywhere. But even if we could overcome all that, wouldn't there be pushback from an industry that's built on cheap flights, mass tourism, and quick profits?
Oh, there would definitely be resistance. Change is hard, especially when it disrupts the way things have always been done, the power structures, the money flow. But I do think there's a growing awareness that the current path isn't sustainable. We're seeing more and more destinations struggling with overtourism, environmental damage, social inequalities.
It does feel like we're reaching a tipping point, like the negative consequences of unsustainable tourism are becoming impossible to ignore. Maybe that's what it'll take to spark real change.
I think you might be right. As those consequences become more and more obvious for both the industry and for travelers, people are going to start looking for alternatives. And that's where this Saudi model, with its focus on actually regenerating things and bringing tangible benefits to local communities, could really become influential.
So it's not necessarily about copying their exact blueprint, but taking those principles and adapting them to different places.
Exactly. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. Every destination has its own unique set of challenges and opportunities. But those core principles, restoring ecosystems, empowering communities, minimizing environmental impact, those apply everywhere.
And we've actually seen some of those principles being put into practice in other parts of the world. New Zealand has its Tiaki Promise, which encourages visitors to care for the environment and respect Maori culture. And Costa Rica, which has been a leader in ecotourism for a long time, is now shifting toward the more regenerative approach.
Great examples, and they show that this movement is gaining momentum. But we're still in the early stages. One thing I find encouraging about what Saudi Arabia is doing is their commitment to being transparent, making decisions based on data. They're not just talking about sustainability, they're measuring their impact and publishing detailed reports.
That kind of accountability is so important. It sets a standard for the whole industry. Travelers need to be able to trust that when a destination or a company says they're regenerative, it's not just greenwashing.
Absolutely. We need clear definitions, measurable standards, independent verification. Otherwise, regenerative tourism risks becoming just another meaningless buzzword.
So where do we go from here? If we want to see this model truly take root and spread, what needs to happen?
I think it boils down to collaboration. Governments, businesses, local communities, travelers, everyone working together towards a common goal, sharing knowledge, resources, best practices, and being willing to challenge the way things have always been done, to embrace new ideas.
It sounds like a huge task, but also incredibly exciting.
Yeah.
Imagine a world where travel isn't just about personal enjoyment, but about making a positive impact. A world where we explore the planet in a way that heals it instead of harming it.
That's the dream, right? And while we have a long way to go to get there, I think this experiment in Saudi Arabia, as bold as it is, shows us it's possible. It's a reminder that even in the most unexpected places, we can find seeds of change.
And those seeds have the potential to grow into something truly amazing. So as we wrap up our deep dive today, we encourage you to stay curious, keep exploring, and think about how you can be a part of this movement towards a more regenerative future for travel. Thanks for joining us.